Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
This Christmas, I didn't even make it to dessert before the words came out of my sister's mouth like a knife pressed into my skin and twisted with a smile. She leaned back in her chair, her wine glass tilted in her hand, and announced to the table, my parents included, without even a blink, that I was emotionally draining and that maybe next year it would be best if I wasn't included in family gatherings. There was a soft laugh from her, the kind of laugh people use to dress up cruelty and pass it off as banter, but the silence that followed was louder than any insult. My mother adjusted her napkin in her lap and cleared her throat as though she had something to say, but couldn't quite bring herself to defend me. My father busied himself with refilling his glass, his eyes deliberately avoiding mine. And I sat there, chewing the last bite of stuffing that suddenly tasted like cardboard, realizing that the years of sacrifices, favors, and late-night phone calls to bail them out, financially or emotionally, meant absolutely nothing the moment my sister decided to rewrite the script. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would slice the smugness from her face, but the words never came. Instead, I looked at the candles flickering in the center of the table, thought about how much money I had transferred just the week before for her next semester's tuition, and felt a slow, steady wave of anger replace the hurt. I swallowed, not just the food but the temptation to scream, and managed a smile so tight it almost cracked my face. "Pass the potatoes," I said, and my sister smirked like she'd already won some invisible game. The rest of the meal passed in that unbearable half-silence, the one where everyone pretends nothing happened while every fork clink feels like a gunshot. Emily, the golden child, always talked about her plans for spring break in Paris, a trip my parents had practically bankrolled under the excuse of life experience, while I kept thinking about the student loan payments I had quietly taken over for her so she wouldn't sink into debt. I glanced at my mother as she laughed politely at Emily's story about shopping for designer boots, and there it was again, the same expression she'd worn my whole life, the one that said, "She's special. You're stable. You'll understand." When the plates were cleared, I stood up to help with the dishes, because that's what I always did: fill in the cracks, make the evening run smoothly, play the part of the dependable one while Emily burned like a firework and got all the attention. As I rinsed plates in the sink, I could hear them in the living room, voices light again, as though I wasn't in the house. I could have cried, but instead, I let my lips curl into a small, private grin. If I was so emotionally draining, maybe it was time I stopped being their lifeline. When I left that night, I hugged my mother, who barely met my eyes, kissed my father's cheek, and gave Emily a quick nod she didn't deserve. The air outside was sharp and cold, and the Christmas lights in the neighborhood blinked with a cheer that felt almost cruel. I walked to my car, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine for several minutes. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and scrolled to the line of monthly payments I had scheduled, the health insurance plan that still had Emily listed as a dependent, the tuition transfers that cleared without anyone even asking how I managed them. My finger hovered over the cancellation button, and for the first time in years, I felt a spark of real control. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the streets mostly empty except for the occasional car rushing back to holiday warmth. My apartment was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that used to feel lonely but now felt like freedom. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on the screen like it was waiting for me to decide what kind of person I wanted to be from this moment forward: the reliable daughter and sister who carried everyone's burdens, or the woman who finally decided to let them carry their own. My phone buzzed once, a text from Emily, a simple, "Thanks for the gift. I'll think of you in Paris," with a winking emoji, as though mocking me for the sweater I had bought her while she had Europe ahead of her. I didn't respond. I closed the message, opened my banking app again, and stared at the options. Cancel, edit, pause. My finger brushed the screen, not enough to commit, but enough to taste the possibility. I leaned back, let the silence settle, and allowed myself to picture it: Emily opening her tuition portal and seeing the balance unpaid, my parents calling the insurance office and learning she wasn't covered anymore. I imagined their confusion, their frantic calls, the moment they realized that the daughter they dismissed as draining was the one who had kept everything afloat. My heart beat faster at the thought, not from guilt but from something dangerously close to satisfaction. That night, I didn't press cancel. Not yet. But I slept better than I had in months, and when I woke up the next morning, I already knew what I was going to do. The family thought Christmas dinner had been the end of the story. They were wrong. For me, it had just begun. I woke before sunrise with the kind of clear head that usually only arrives on the first morning of a vacation, the apartment still dim and cold, the city outside wrapped in quiet. And I stood in the kitchen with my hands around a mug of coffee that tasted stronger than usual while my mind sifted through a ledger nobody in my family had ever asked to see. A careful record written in private rituals and automatic drafts, and my name quietly attached to obligations that never earned me so much as a thank you card. It is funny how a budget, once you really look at it without the fog of habit, turns into a map of a relationship, every monthly deduction pointing toward an expectation you agreed to before you realized it was a contract written in disappearing ink. There was the health plan that I had upgraded when my sister sprained her ankle during that ill-advised Pilates phase. There was the tuition autopay that I had set up after my mother called me whispering about deadlines and humiliation. There were the holiday plane tickets I had bought for them in the year of the big layoff that somehow became my responsibility every year since, not because I was generous, though I was, but because I was convenient. I opened the laptop and stared at the neat rows of transactions, my cursor hovering as though it needed moral permission, and I let myself replay the old refrains that had trained me to ignore resentment. You're the stable one. You have a good job. She is under pressure. We will pay you back when things calm down. Please do not make a scene because your grandmother is watching. We just want peace at the table. Peace, I thought, is such a strange word for a family that cannot sit through one holiday without drawing blood in designer gloves, and once I thought that, I could not unthink it. And the quiet kindness I had used to talk myself out of my own anger felt suddenly like a trick I was done performing. The first call I made was to the insurance provider, because I wanted a voice to tell me there would be a firm line, a clear date, a confirmation number that did not care about guilt or tradition. The hold music was bright and chirpy in a way that felt indecent at this hour, and while it played I looked at the plant on my windowsill that I had nursed back from brown and brittle to a stubborn green. And I wondered when I had learned to keep broken things alive that did not want to grow. A woman answered and asked for my details, and I gave them calmly, my voice steady. And when she asked for the reason I needed to remove a dependent, I said the sentence I had rehearsed in my head all night, an honest sentence that doubled as a private verdict. The dependent no longer depends on me. There was a pause that felt almost respectful, then the tapping of keys, and the agent explained the dates, the grace periods, the precise moment at which coverage would lapse, and she asked if I understood. That any claims after that time would be denied. I said that I did, and I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork. When the email confirmation arrived with its polite language and neat bullet points, I read it twice and then once again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the shape of the decision settle into my bones. A new architecture that would hold under pressure. I could hear my sister's voice in my head, emotionally draining, and I thought about the joke beneath the insult. How she could afford to say it because someone else was paying the premium for her emergencies. And the humor of that landed in me like a stone in deep water. I closed the tab and opened the tuition portal, and there it was, the clean monthly transfer that had pulled money from my account without complaint, the payment schedule that gave her life a cushion and gave me a monthly reminder that I was not allowed to be tired. I did not cancel it right away. Instead, I clicked through the fine print, learning the refund windows and the late fee structures that college administrators have turned into a science, and somewhere between the words student responsibility and failure to remit, I let myself laugh, quietly, at the symmetry of it all, because for once the rules were on my side. I drafted a short note to the financial office that did not explain my family drama or ask for understanding, a tidy message confirming the termination of the autopay and the reversion of responsibility to the student. And I sat with that draft on my screen until my coffee grew cold and the little bar in the corner told me the morning had truly begun. A memory slipped in like a splinter from an old wooden door. My sister at 18, crying on the kitchen floor about application essays and roommates, and the terror of life beyond her bedroom wall. And me on the linoleum beside her with a legal pad and a schedule and a promise that I would keep her from falling while she learned to walk in the world. The promise had been meant for a season, a bridge between shores, and somewhere along the way it had become a ferry that never docked. Nobody told me to step off, so I forgot I could, and that is on me as much as it is on them. Though that does not make the bruise hurt less. I hit send, finally, and watched the message leave my outbox with the kind of calm that used to follow a run at dawn, the body warm and awake, the mind lit but not frantic. And I closed the laptop because I knew if I kept going I would torch the whole forest before lunch. On the counter sat the sweater I had been knitting for my mother, a habit I had picked up to quiet anxious hands, and I folded it carefully and set it in a drawer because some gifts do not need to be given to count as finished. I showered, dressed, and went to work, where my colleagues were trading leftovers and half-jokes about relatives, and when someone asked how my holiday had gone, I said it had been enlightening, which was true. And then I organized a spreadsheet with the kind of precision that makes me feel like the world can be held together if the columns line up. By mid-afternoon, the tremor of risk arrived, a ripple in the confidence that had carried me through the day, and I checked my phone with a flicker of dread that I found oddly intoxicating, the way a first step off a cliff feels when you know there is water below. There were no calls, no messages, no sudden emergencies, only a new email in my inbox from the same insurance provider whose line I had waited on before sunrise, an automated notice addressed not to me but to the removed dependent, confirming the change and listing the date beyond which any coverage would no longer apply, and I stared at the subject line so long I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth because I understood what that meant as clearly as a siren in an empty street. I did not open it, not yet. I let it sit there glowing with the promise of impact, and I pictured my sister reading it between classes, or over coffee, or while trying on a dress she could not afford for a trip she did not earn. And I imagined the shape her mouth would make as she understood that the ground had shifted, and that the person she liked to call a drain had quietly pulled the plug. Then another message slid in on top of it, this one from the university billing office, short and clipped in that bureaucratic way that mistakes authority for tone, and before I could even click, my screen lit again with a third notification. This time from my mother, a subject line built from a single long word that looked like a scream without sound, and I sat perfectly still with my hands folded because revenge, when it arrives, is never as loud as the moment before it hits. I did not open my mother's message because I knew that once I let her tone flood my living room it would rearrange the gravity in the room and drag me back into that orbit where I apologize for causing storms that were already brewing long before I learned to name the clouds, so I set the phone face down on the table and decided that if I was going to be accused of being dramatic I might as well be deliberate instead, which is how I found myself turning quiet decisions into a sequence, almost like choreography. Each step rational on its own and devastating in combination, because when a person carries a family's conveniences for long enough, removing even one strap makes the entire pack slip. I began with the small cords that always look too thin to matter until they snap, going into my streaming accounts and removing the familiar unauthorized profiles that had multiplied like ivy in the years when I thought sharing a password proved we were close. And then I logged into the cell phone account I had subsidized after the infamous cracked screen incident and separated the lines with the kind of precision you use when you cut a garment on grain. Because there is a point beyond which generosity becomes costume design for other people's performances, and I was done stitching. While the pages loaded and logged me out and demanded the usual cycle of codes, I opened a new document and wrote something I had never written before in my own voice, a letter that did not ask for recognition or affection or even fairness, but laid out terms as cleanly as a contract because I finally understood that boundaries only exist when they are spelled out in unignorable ink. I listed the obligations I had carried, the dates they began, the reasons they would end, and the expectation that all communication going forward would be written and calm and respectful, which sounded cold in my head and sounded like oxygen on the page. I kept the tone free of poison, no sarcasm, no guilt, because I wanted to read it later and feel proud rather than clever, and when I reached the part where I needed to explain what would happen if the rules were ignored, I paused long enough to let my pulse slow and then wrote that I would invoice for future costs incurred by anyone who used my name to secure services without consent, and that those invoices would not be jokes, and that I would pursue collection as any adult must when agreements are broken, and reading that line back to myself felt outrageous and healthy in the same breath. At work, the building's elevator mirror returned my face to me with a directness I had been avoiding for months, and I caught sight of a woman who looked like she had finally placed her own seatbelt first on a plane where the masks had already dropped, which made me smile despite the knot in my stomach, because relief almost always arrives wearing the same clothes as fear. My inbox, which is ordinarily a quilt of deadlines and meeting invites and kind reminders from people who rely on me in ways that do not feel corrosive, had become a small stage for family theater. So I created a filter with an almost petty satisfaction, rerouting messages that contained a familiar set of names to a folder I titled, with a humor that felt both accurate and mean, Museum of Emergencies. And I watched the first few exhibits slide in behind the velvet rope, subject lines full of that curdled blend of accusation and pleading that I can smell even through the screen. It is incredible what the body notices once the mind stops negotiating on its behalf, and by early afternoon I could feel muscles in my neck releasing like stubborn knots under warm water, a sensation that made room for thoughts that had been waiting in the corridor, like the one reminding me that my sister still had a spare key to my apartment from the summer she house sat, mostly by using my couch as a launch pad for late nights. So on my break I walked 2 blocks to the hardware store with the bell that chimes in a tone that makes childhood memories swing like porch swings, and I asked them to rekey my locks while I waited, a brief errand that felt heavier than most medical procedures because it rearranged who could borrow my piece without asking. I held the new keys in my palm with a dignity that surprised me, and when I returned to my desk, I slid them into a drawer the way a person tucks away proof that they have finally become the adult in their own life. By late afternoon, the emotional weather shifted, as if the universe had patiently waited for business hours to end before opening the sky, and my phone began to rattle with the kind of persistence that announces a campaign rather than a conversation. First, a cascade of texts that broke into my screen like flyers under a windshield wiper. Why are you doing this? Your sister is delicate. We raised you better than to humiliate family. This is not the time for lessons. And then, somehow more insulting, a cheerful message from my sister requesting a ride to the airport next week because rideshares surge around the holidays, and she knows I love saving money. A sentence that made me laugh out loud in the nearly empty office in a way that startled the cleaning crew vacuuming a distant hallway. I did not answer any of it because silence is a language I am finally fluent in, but I did take one last step that counted as both housekeeping and declaration when I went into our old family photo album on social media and quietly changed the settings on the most flattering pictures of me so that I could no longer be tagged in their memory plays without consent, a tiny act that broke a ritual nobody else knew how to read yet. Evening fell with that dull silver light the city wears after holidays, when the air seems to apologize for the mess people made of their joy, and I returned home to the quiet I had chosen, where I poured a glass of water and reread the letter I had drafted in the morning, smoothing out a few sentences that tried to be kinder than they needed to be, and then I printed it on heavy paper because I wanted to feel its weight, folded it once, and slid it into an envelope addressed to my parents. House with my sister's name in the subject line like a memo, a choice that felt both old-fashioned and precise. I walked it to the corner mailbox, dropped it like a coin into a well, and as I stood there with the winter air in my lungs and the street almost empty, my phone finally rang with a number I did not recognize, but felt like family anyway, and when I picked up, braced for my mother's trembling narrative, a man introduced himself in a crisp voice as the financial aid director calling about a matter that had just been escalated, and he wondered, politely and thoroughly, whether I might confirm a few details about a payment history that now appeared to be in dispute. The financial aid director's voice had that careful, neutral cadence that people practice when their job requires them to referee money and panic at the same time, and while he introduced himself with a formality that felt older than email, I opened my notebook because I've learned that the quickest way to stay calm is to let the pen move faster than the drama, so I wrote the date in the corner, underlined it once, and listened as he explained that a third-party payer authorization attached to my name had been uploaded again that morning with a digital signature block that did not match the one they had on file, which meant either a harmless clerical error or a less harmless attempt to restore a convenience I had just canceled. And when he asked whether I had personally submitted that form, I said that I had not, and then I waited through the small silence that always follows the word no when it closes a door people expected to walk through. He cleared his throat, apologized for the inconvenience, and explained that their compliance office would place a temporary administrative hold on the account until the discrepancy could be resolved, which would pause certain privileges like registration and transcript requests, and he asked, almost apologetically, whether I wanted to add a note to the file, something brief that could guide future staff if similar activity occurred, and I surprised myself by speaking in a tone I recognized from meetings where I advocate for other people, a tone that does not beg for fairness, but presumes it, and I said that any authorizations bearing my name should be considered invalid unless accompanied by a call from the number he had just reached and a written follow-up that includes the phrase, "Revocation of consent acknowledged," and he repeated the phrase back to me like a student who intends to get the spelling right. Before we ended the call, he hesitated, then mentioned that sometimes families fall into what he called enthusiastic problem-solving, which is a euphemism that made me smile despite the throb gathering behind my eyes. And he suggested that I also check the student portal's proxy permissions, because in his experience those toggles can end up flipped by people who assume that access grows back on its own like grass, and I thanked him with a sincerity that felt both old and new, then logged in and navigated through tabs that tried very hard to hide the settings that matter, and when I found the page that listed my email under Authorized Viewer, I removed it with a click that felt less like withdrawal and more like accurate labeling. Because if a person insists on calling you emotionally draining while drinking from a glass you are filling, it is not a betrayal to put the pitcher down. Only after the university screens went still did I open the messages that had been piling up, starting with my mother's, which was long and breathless and full of the phrases she saves for days when she wants me to remember that I was a difficult baby and a stubborn child and an exacting adult who has always made holidays harder than they need to be. Although she prefers to package those assessments in stories about how I would line up my crayons by shade and refuse to share, as if an early love of order explains a lifetime of being recruited as a human safety net, and tucked between her laments were small bright shards of accusation. Your sister's fragile. Your sister had a panic episode last spring. Your sister cannot be expected to manage bureaucracies when she is trying so hard, and I read the whole thing twice, because I wanted to verify that I was not missing an apology hid in the margins like a coupon, and when I was sure there wasn't one, I flagged the email for my folder and stood up to breathe on the balcony where the air felt like clean paper waiting for ink. The next message, shorter and colder, came from my father, who has always preferred declarative sentences to conversations, and he wrote that while he respected my right to allocate my resources as I saw fit, I was courting consequences that would, in the end, embarrass us all, which is the kind of sentence men use when what they mean is that somebody else will be inconvenienced in public, and underneath that line he pasted a screenshot of my sister's billing page that she had apparently forwarded to him in a flurry, its red banners pulsing like warning lights on a dashboard, and perhaps because I was tired or perhaps because I was finally awake, I noticed that the screenshot included not only balances and due dates, but also a faint thumbnail of a document bearing my name in a corner watermark, which meant she had not just forwarded a summary. She had attached evidence of the forgery without realizing it, and the discovery slid into place with the cold elegance of a jigsaw piece that had been hiding under the table leg. If revenge is best enjoyed at room temperature, accountability is best delivered with receipts, so I assembled a tidy packet with the original authorization I had filed months ago, the morning's confirmation of termination. The new forged upload that telegraphed its clumsy birth through mismatched signature metadata and the call log entry from the director, and I sent it not to my mother, not to my father, and certainly not to my sister, but to the university's compliance address with a subject line so plain it could not be accused of theater, followed by a brief note that requested the hold remain until the origin of the document was established and that any communications about payment or reinstatement be routed through the office rather than through me, because I wished to end the cycle in which family urgency dresses up as policy. I added, as a courtesy I will probably never receive in return, a line expressing hope that the student would be supported through any academic inconvenience created by the situation, and I meant it, because I do not want her life to break. I just want it to stop resting on my spine. By the time dusk had flattened the city into shapes that look softer than their daytime selves, my phone lit with a new message that did not resemble the others. A concise email from the university's integrity office acknowledging receipt of my materials and confirming that the account would be locked pending review, and at the bottom a sentence I read 3 times to be sure I had not invented it, noting that any attempt to reauthorize with a disputed signature during an active hold would generate an automatic fraud flag and a campus conduct referral, which meant that for once the architecture of rules might stand between me and the machinery of guilt, and the relief I felt was clean enough to taste. I closed the laptop, washed a dish that did not need washing because my hands wanted movement, and when I looked up, the answering machine tone of the blocked call notification pulsed on my screen like a heartbeat I had not agreed to share, and with a curiosity that surprised me, I tapped to reveal the voicemail transcription, only to read a single sentence in my sister's voice, clipped and unfamiliar, saying that if I did not fix what I had broken she would have no choice but to send the document she had borrowed to someone who would make sure my employer heard about the kind of person I really am, which made me sit very still because the threat was empty in one way and loaded in another, and it told me exactly what I needed to do next. I have learned that when someone threatens to tell your story for you, the only antidote is to write an unembellished version in ink and deliver it to every office that might someday be asked to judge your character. So I spent the next morning in a quiet conference room with the blinds half drawn, the kind of room where companies ask for candor and then pretend not to flinch when they receive it. And I spoke to our human resources director and to the in-house counsel over a speakerphone line. That made everyone sound like they were standing at the edge of a lake, laying out a timeline that began with a holiday dinner and ended with a forged authorization, a threatened escalation, and a decision to protect my name in ways I should have practiced years ago. I brought the written packet I had sent to the university. I included the voicemail transcript that curled like a warning label around every syllable of my sister's ultimatum, and I watched the counsel make a neat note when I said that I would understand if the company preferred distance around family disputes, but that I could not allow a false narrative to arrive before I did. And when the meeting concluded with an unhurried assurance that they appreciated my transparency and that any third-party communication would be routed through legal, I felt the floor of my life level by a degree so slight it could not be seen. Only felt by the way my shoulders stopped trying to live near my ears. After lunch, I walked to a notary public who keeps her office in a storefront that once sold wedding dresses, a detail that would feel too on the nose if I were inventing it. And I signed a sworn statement acknowledging that my signature had been used without permission on an educational finance document, then made copies for the university and for a small stack of envelopes addressed to myself. Because there is a strange comfort in the old practice of mailing evidence to one's own door at a time. Stamp the truth, and I slipped the envelopes into the blue box on the corner with a sense that I was memorializing not just an event, but a boundary that would not be allowed to dissolve in the wash of family tears. Back at home, I placed a freeze with the credit bureaus, filed a brief police report for identity misuse that I do not expect to see prosecuted, but will be grateful to have in a number I can recite later. And then I sat at my kitchen table with a pad of paper and drafted one last letter, not to the university or to an office that exists precisely to hold lines, but to my sister, whose voice I can still hear as a child insisting she saw a shape in the clouds that definitely did not exist and daring me to argue with her certainty. In the letter I did not lecture, because lectures are gifts to people who like to perform contrition without practicing it. I offered a choice with edges rounded enough to be held, telling her that if she contacted the integrity office by the end of the week, acknowledged the forgery, and enrolled in whatever ethics module universities prescribe when students confuse wants with rights, I would, as a one-time act and without further discussion, pay the current late fee to prevent the hold from metastasizing into a lost semester, after which all financial ties would remain severed and all future obligations would be hers alone, while if she preferred the path she had threatened, noise, escalation, the fantasy of public shaming, I would forward the evidence packet to the Dean of Students and to the Campus Conduct Board preemptively and allow the process to do what it does when patience runs out, and I wrote that sentence slowly because I wanted it to sound neither triumphant nor meek. Only adult. I printed the letter, folded it on the clean line, and drove it to the overnight mail office because timing is its own language in families that have trained themselves to ignore meaning until a deadline translates it. The reply did not arrive in words so much as in orchestrated weather, beginning with a flood of emails from my mother that wrapped themselves in the gauze of worry and bled into the red of accusation. And then a message from my father that tried very hard to look like diplomacy, but read like a courtroom transcript prepared by someone who believes tone is evidence. Followed by a text from a cousin I have not seen in years relaying that I was hurting people who loved me and asking whether I remembered the summer we built a fort in the backyard and swore we would never let anyone feel left out again. I remembered the fort, and I remembered that I paid for the lumber because the adults said they would reimburse and then forgot. Which is how so many stories in this family begin, and I turned my phone face down because none of it was new information, only recycled theater with fresh program notes. For the first time since Christmas, I slept without dreaming of forms and deadlines, and in the morning the city felt newly scrubbed by cold air, the kind that insists on wakefulness, and I took a long walk that ended in a cafe where the barista wrote my name on a paper cup and pronounced it right on the first try. A small grace that felt improbable enough to make my eyes sting. In the early afternoon, the email I had been waiting for arrived not from my sister, but from the University Integrity Office, a short message acknowledging that the student had contacted them, accepted responsibility for the disputed upload, and agreed to complete a conduct process that would allow the administrative hold to convert into a conditional registration status upon receipt of the late fee, and at the bottom a line, almost an afterthought, confirming that a note had been placed on the account to prohibit third-party authorizations without direct verification via 2 separate channels, one of which would always include a live conversation with me. I read the message once and then a second time. The relief complicated by a small ache that no administrative process can touch, and I sent the late fee with the kind of unsentimental precision you bring to a final inventory. Then closed the browser and stood at the window long enough to see my reflection settle into the glass like a person arriving in her own life. By evening, the family attempted what passes in our lineage for reconciliation, which is not apology but choreography, a group message from my mother announcing that tensions were cooling, a photo from my father of the tree in the living room trimmed to the inch, a single direct text from my sister that read, in a tone of weary magnanimity, that she would prefer we reset in the new year and that perhaps there was a way for us to divide responsibilities that felt balanced, a word that made me laugh because it rarely appears in the mouths of people who have never carried anything heavier than the story in which they are the injured protagonist. I typed a response that contained exactly 2 sentences, both longer than they needed to be and neither unkind. I said that I wished her a calm winter and that I would be available for conversations that did not ask me to pay for grace. And I pressed send knowing that the silence that followed might last, which is both a grief and a relief. Near midnight, with the city quiet enough that I could hear the elevator cables breathe in the shaft, a final email arrived from an address I did not recognize. A scanned family photo I had never seen of me at about 6 years old sitting cross-legged under a crooked paper star, coloring inside the lines while my sister slept on my shoulder, the file name a string of numbers and the subject line blank, and beneath the image a single sentence in my father's clipped style that did not apologize. but did resemble an admission, saying only that for years they had let me be the adult because I was good at it, and that perhaps they had mistaken competence for consent. I closed the laptop without replying, stood at the window with the lights off, and watched a neighbor carry a dry tree to the curb, needles leaving a green trail that would remain until morning, a beautiful mess pointing at a door. The phone buzzed once more with a message from my mother that I did not open, and I let the unanswered screen glow on the table while I whispered into the dark the only truth I could live with tonight, that I had set the bill down and walked away, and that if they ever learned to carry their own weight I would meet them at the edge of it, but that I would not. Not again. Walk back into a house that required me to be both the foundation and the furniture.